Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's time for me to do Console Wars Part 11, Retro Gaming. I apologize for the last two videos being sort of short. I don't know enough about mobile gaming to talk about it, more than what I did. And PC gaming I'm not a fan of, so I've already said all I have to say about it. Today we're talking about retro gaming as a thing. This one I have the most to say on any video game Console Wars subject so far, so this is gonna be the longest video in this series, most likely, just because I got a lot to say. I'm gonna start off with my definition of retro. I do not subscribe to the retro is old. Retro, as a term, means an aesthetic of the past. That's what it means. Something that is modern, that is designed specifically to be reminiscent of the past. That's what retro as a definition means. I'm not using that definition either. To me, retro is everything that came before the PlayStation. Modern is everything that came after the PlayStation being on the fence. And postmodern is everything that came after the PS3. However, I do recognize that retro gaming as a concept to the greater retro community just means outdated. So most people define retro as either arbitrarily 20 years old or older, which I have a hard time with. For one, the PS2 lasted forever. So how do you put that in, how do you lump that in with retro or not? And the other term they use is 2 generations back, which again, the PS2 was still being sold after they had already discontinued the PS3. So do you consider the PS3 retro before the PS2? I have a hard time with that. Is it when the system came out or when it ended? Because some of these systems had really long lifespans. The Famicom in Japan lasted a lot longer than the NES did in the US. The Master System went on for an ungodly amount of time in Brazil. Is that a modern system or is that a retro system? I don't know. So here's what I'm talking about retro. To me, retro pretty much means anything from the 80s or 90s or older. And it specifically means anything that was made in that time period or anything that is made to be reminiscent of that time period or modern games that are throwbacks to that time period. So retro doesn't necessarily mean old as far as I'm concerned. So a lot of new games can still be considered retro in my book. NES Remix on the Wii U is a prime example of a modern retro game. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go ahead and stick to the broader definition of anything that's old or anything that's reminiscent of anything that's old. So the concept of retro gaming first came on the scene in the late 90s, where people were starting to get reminiscent of the past. Mostly they were reminiscent of the stuff from the early 80s and the NES era. PlayStation came on the scene. N64 came on the scene. Both were very divisive to older gamers because they didn't have anything for older gamers. If you grew up on 2D games, arcade games, old school PC games, and side-scrolling 8-bit games, the N64 had nothing for you. Unless you were willing to give 3D a try. And a lot of people weren't. There were a lot of gamers that had some tremendous pushback on the N64. A lot of Nintendo gamers did not buy the N64. They either bought the PlayStation because it had enough of the 2D style games to keep them satisfied, or they shifted to PC, or they just stuck to their retro games until something more familiar to them came along. A lot of people stuck with the retro games from this time period going forward. This was when we started to see the movement of people that were like stuck in the past. This was around the time period where you started to see people going for complete NES collections, and the NES elevated itself to a whole new stratosphere of fans because it became the face, the poster child of retro gaming. So to a lot of people, the word retro just means NES. Now that's not very, very fair or accurate to everybody, but as a whole, that's pretty much like the standard of retro, and then everything else just revolves around it. But to some younger people, the PS2 is retro. So I'll respect that. insofar as to them the PS2 is retro because that's what they grew up with. I'm not ever going to consider the PS2 retro no matter how old it gets because it's a modern console. It has modern games. The game design on the PS2 was modern. There were no old school retro style games on the PS2. I know this gets complicated once you get into PS3 and PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, the Wii U, and the Switch, because you have a lot of retro style games on those consoles, especially Steam and GOG. So like I said, things get a little confusing. So, like, hard retro to me is everything before 2000. I'll just that's the cutoff. But loose retro is everything that is inspired by or designed to be reminiscent of anything from that time period, 2000 or older. So that's what I'm going to go with. So let's start with just the old school stuff. I've already talked about some of this, but some of your oldest video games, you've got the Channel F, you got the Odyssey, Odyssey 2, you got the Pong systems, you got the 2600, 5200, 7800, you got the ColecoVision, you got the Intellivision. These make up the early days of gaming. Retro collectors or retro gamers tend to ignore this time period. This time period, if you're into retro gaming at all from this time period, you're pretty much going to look at the Atari 2600 and ignore everything else. Unless you were alive back then, which is like what we're going to talk about. There are pretty much three classes of retro gamers that I've observed. Class number one are the old farts that grew up with this stuff that are just stuck in the past because this is their childhood. You could almost put me in this camp. Sure. The second class of retro gamers are people who got into retro gaming by way of modern systems. This would be like discovering retro games either through emulation or the virtual console, Xbox Live Arcade, Steam, etc. And they've gone back and tried to rediscover these old games because they have a fascination with history and what came before. The third class of retro gamer is the retro gamer that is the lapsed gamer. Someone who gave up on modern consoles for whatever reason and went back to retro games because it's a more familiar time to them or a more familiar aesthetic. And so they want something from their childhood because it's reminiscent of their childhood. So they're very similar to the old farts. The old farts have just never let go of the past. They bought their NES and they stopped. They've just collected NES and maybe Master System when they got all the NES games. And maybe they branched into 7800 and stuff in that orbit. But they're pretty much, they've always only ever owned retro systems. So you also have emulation, which we're going to talk about. This comes in a couple of different methods. But you also have modern retro consoles, like retro clones, and modern consoles that can play retro games, like the PS4 and PS5 can play old school PS1, PS2 games. And I think old school is a better term than retro. I think we used to call ourselves old school gamers, and then the word retro gaming came on the scene. But I think if you want to call the PS2 old school, I'm fine with that. But if you want to call the PS2 retro, I'm not okay with that. So if you want to say you're a retro gamer and you use the word retro to mean old school, to me, I'm just going to assume you're an old school gamer and go with that. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. We really started to see a resurgence of these old school games in the PS1, PS2 era. We started to see this with a lot of compilations. You had Namco Museum, Midway's Arcade Treasures, you had the Street Fighter collection, you had the SNK collections, the Neo Geo collection, Samurai Showdown, etc. You had the Sega Genesis collections, the Mega Man collections, you had the Capcom collections, the Taito collections. Who else? Who else did these? I don't know if Konami did any collections or not, but they may have. And then you had the Nintendo dabbled. On the GBA, they had the classic NES series. And on starting with the Wii, they had the Virtual Console. So the retro scene, as we know it today, really started with the Wii and the Xbox Live Arcade, where you were getting retro or old school PC games and arcade games on the Xbox console. PS3 kind of did the same thing. I have a hard time with PS3 as retro because it can play PS1 games and certain models can play PS2 games, which means it exists as a modern console that it can also play retro games and old school games. So it's kind of a bridge system. The PS2, I definitely consider an old school system because it can play PS1 games, which there are a lot of retro games on the PS1. Not just games released at the time, like, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Twisted Metal, etc. But also games that were literal, like I said, the previously compilations, but also like games that were modern reinterpretations of classic games, like Frogger, Asteroids, Tetris Plus, and some others. So that sort of, came about in the late 90s. More modern times, we have two forms of retro consoles that play old games, but they're modern systems. You have the FPGA, which is sort of a console, a board on a chip. It's usually, I would say, a 3D printed chip that can simulate the original hardware from the old systems. The second method is emulation. And I'm not going to get into which is better. I'm not going to get into that argument. A lot of these retro clones either come with... most of them are compatible with original... Most of them, not all, are compatible with original cartridges. So you could plug your Atari, Nintendo, Sega, Super Nintendo, and 64 cartridges into the system and it'll play, depending on which system you have. And a lot of them have retro style controllers that are reminiscent of old school controllers, but they're modern controllers. And some of them actually have ports for original controllers. And some of them just have USB ports for modern USB controllers that are retro controllers. So you have NES controllers with the USB cord instead of the NES cord, etc. Those controllers can also be used on PCs, and PCs is another gateway through to retro and old school games by way of emulation, which is how I do it. It's my preferred method. You also have Nintendo tried to cash in on the retro craze during the Wii U generation when the Wii U was stinking up the place, and they introduced the NES Classic Mini and the Super NES Classic Mini. And then you had a few clones. You had the Genesis, the Commodore 64, and the PlayStation, but those minis all suck. And so this gave younger gamers and modern gamers a way to experience those classic or retro games in a new way, while remaining semi-authentic to the experience. So going back to the types of retro gamers you also have those who are original hardware only. So these people want an original NES with original NES controllers and accessories and original NES cartridges. They do not want flash cards. They do not want ROMs. They, by and large, do not want homebrews. They just want what was made in 1980, whatever, and that's all they want. These collectors will collect all the way up to modern systems and call those retro. Some of them to my annoyance, and some of them I just don't give a shit. If you want to consider the Dreamcast retro, I'll give it to you. If you want to consider the Wii retro, I just don't know if I'm going to agree to that. I don't know. As a retro vehicle, the Wii is a vehicle to retro games. And the classic controller is definitely a retro style controller. So is the Wii remote. So I'll give you the Wii, I guess, as a retro console, sure. And then you have modded consoles like the Xbox, the Wii, and you could also mod some other consoles, but they would allow you to play emulation and ROMs on your consoles, most notably the original Xbox and the Wii. But other consoles could be modded as well. But those were the two big ones. Most people that were modding their PS1 were doing so to play import games, and most people that were modding their Xbox 360 were doing so to play pirate games. Like I said, most people, not necessarily all. So there's that whole emulation scene as well. And then you have the original cartridge but not original hardware people. These people want original carts, for the most part, But they're okay with a retro clone as long as it's physical. It's a physical thing they can touch. Now, the emulation people come in a couple of different camps. You have the Nintendo Switch Online, Wii U Virtual Console, Wii U Virtual Console, Xbox Live Arcade, Steam, GOG people that will buy or play through subscription or whatever retro games on official channels, on official modern hardware. So people who will play NES games on their Switch or whatever, PS1 games on their PS5, etc. So those people do exist as well. And they tend to be some of the more vocal ones. They may not be the majority, but they think they are because they're the most vocal. And then you have emulation on non-standard consoles. This is your PC emulation, your mobile, like your cell phone, your smartphone, your tablet, and things like the Retro Pi and stuff like that. The Steam box and stuff like that. Like I said, that's my preferred method. Now, emulation gets a bad rep for a variety of reasons, which I'll dispel why I don't agree with those reasons. Number one, the physical argument. I will argue that digital is the preferred method of preservation over physical, because those physical cartridges are going to crap out eventually, and then you've just got a piece of plastic that does nothing. So dumping those ROMs onto a computer and saving them on a server is going to keep them available to more people for a longer term than those physical. Because in 40 years from now, 100% of the NES cartridges will no longer work 40 years from now. They have a limited shelf life. Those chips will not last forever. Those components, the connectors, the little pieces of like aluminum that connect it from the PCB to the cartridge slot inside the console are going to wear out over time. That's going to happen. They're going to erode. That is inevitable. It will happen. The CD-ROMs, the physical CD-ROMs are going to rot. They're not going to last forever. They are going to rot. That is going to happen. Every CD on the planet, there's going to come a time where every CD on the planet stops working. There's going to come a time where every DVD on the planet stops working. I am pro-physical media, don't get me wrong. I have over 1,000 DVDs. I have over 500 CDs. I have a handful of vinyl records and cassette tapes. I'm not against physical media as a thing. I'm just saying, if we're being realistic, physical is not the way to preserve things. Now, digital, by way of like official channels, streaming like Netflix and Hulu, etc., is not the way to preserve films, because those services don't last forever. And, you know, movie studios come and go, and the rights to films disappear. Same thing happens with video games. But any video game, look, if I want to play fucking Action 52 or fucking Nintendo World Championships or Flintstones and Dinosaur Peak or whatever the $10,000 NES cartridge of the day is, I can play it right now on my laptop and you can't stop me. Nobody can. I can play it right now. I do not have to pay $10,000 for a fucking cartridge to play a game. Now, some people would say, support the publishers. Okay, here's two things I'm going to say to that. Thing number one, when you go into your used video game store and you buy a copy of Super Mario Bros. 3 NES cartridge from the reseller, Nintendo isn't getting that money. You are not supporting the publisher. You are supporting a reseller. Basically a scalper. You are supporting a scalper. So if you can do that in good conscience, good on you. I can't. I will never give money to a scalper. Ever. Because they'll give you 50 cents for your NES cartridge and sell it for $500. So that's a fucking scalper. And I don't care what anyone says. They all are. Guerrilla Games. Fucking, what's that one that Pixel Sickle is? Ian Ferguson. what is that one, that store he used to run? They're all just scalpers. That's all they are. eBay, fucking your local video game store, Game Exchange, GameStop, they're just scalpers. That's literally all they are. I'm not going to support scalping as an industry. To the argument of support the publishers, look, a lot of those publishers don't exist anymore. The company that made Action 52 went out of business fucking forever ago. Acclaim went out of business fucking forever ago. Nobody has the rights to those LJN games. Nobody does. They went out of business. Nobody bought the rights. They're in limbo. Nobody can put those on the Nintendo Switch service or put them on a compilation disc and sell them to you on your PS5 because they can't. They literally, physically cannot because they do not have the legal rights to that software. So I'm hurting nobody by downloading a title of a digital game from a company that doesn't exist anymore. Now, if you want to track down the original publisher or programmer or artist or whatever and give money to their Kickstarter, good on you, do it. Buy their merch. I don't care. I am all for that. And I never said I advocate for piracy. I never said that. I do not pirate modern games. And for the most part, I'm going to be upfront. I do pirate Nintendo games. NES, Super NES, N64. For the most part, I mostly pirate games I had as a kid. Games I already paid 60, 70, 80 bucks for at one point in time. Nintendo already got the money from me. And according to the DMCA, I have a legal right to have a digital backup of those games. I don't have to keep the physical cartridge. I don't lose my right to that software just because I lost the cartridge at some point in time. The rights stay with me. I also rebought most of those games on the Wii Virtual Console and the Wii U Virtual Console, and I bought a lot of them on the PS1 and PS2 and GameCube and so on and so forth. I have bought almost every retro console compilation that has ever come out when they were new from the retailer, giving my money to the publisher. So I've already paid the publisher for the rights to these games. I'm not going to pay them again. Now, I do not advocate pirating current games from businesses that still exist to an extent. If it's a shady company that's doing shitty things and they're treating their people bad and you know that the money is going to assholes and it's not going to the artists, I don't have a problem pirating those games. That's where it comes on you. It's going to fall on you. But I don't pirate games anyways because it's too fucking complicated. And like I've said previously, I'm not a PC gamer. My laptop doesn't have a graphics card, so I'm pretty much limited to, like, Super NES is like the most advanced. I can't even run N64 emulator on my laptop because it requires hardware acceleration, and I don't have that. It's not an old laptop. It's a brand new laptop, but the graphics card burned out. It's got an NVIDIA GeForce RTX in it, and it burned out, so it literally does nothing. I had to go into the BIOS and disable it. As far as my Windows is concerned, that CPU, that GPU doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So I can't play modern games on my laptop. So I'm stuck with my PS4 for now. So as far as retro, let's go ahead and get into it. I am not a fan of the retro clones. And the reason why I'm not a fan of the retro clones is because I'm not going to buy a machine that some company created, that again, the money doesn't go to the creator. You buy the Retron 5 or whatever, you're not giving money to Nintendo. You buy that Super Mario cartridge from the reseller, that money doesn't go to Nintendo. You're not supporting the publishers doing that. So what the fuck is the goddamn difference? You know what I mean? I'm not going to spend $700 on an NES cartridge when I can get the ROM for free. Especially when the company that made the game doesn't even exist anymore. And I am never going to give money to fucking scalpers. You can do what you want with your money. It's your money. Do what you want. I do not support scalpers. Alright? That's my official stance. And yes, I consider all, even if they're above ground, even if they give fair prices, all retro resellers are scalpers, in my opinion. All of them. 100% of them. All of them. Every retro game reseller that exists is just a scalper as far as I'm concerned. And I will never give any of them money. I am not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying they're scalpers. and I will not give them my money. Like I said, do what you want with your money. Now, GOG has done a really good job keeping classic and retro PC games alive, and so has Steam in its own right. So both have done a really good job keeping retro games alive. I prefer GOG to Steam, mostly because they tend to have the games I want, and at fair prices, but also because I prefer their app, I guess, their program over the Steam client. I prefer the GOG client over the Steam client, partially because I can't remember my fucking Steam password ever. And Steam will only remember your password for so long before it logs you out and makes you log back in again. And then I have to go back to steam.com and log in and do the recover password and create a new password. And that's just a fucking hassle. So I hate Steam for that. Just, it's annoying. GOG doesn't do that. I check the remember password. It never even bothers to ask me again. Steam will remember it for a time, and then it'll just magically log me out all of a sudden and say, you need to re-enter your password for whatever reason, and I hate that. I hate it. It pisses me off. So even if a game is on Steam, and even if it's less money on Steam than GOG, which is rare, but even if it is, I'll still buy it on GOG before I'll buy it on Steam. The only games I buy on Steam are games I can't get from GOG, and I only have like 7 games in my Steam library. I've got a couple hundred games in my GOG library, very easily. And those are all games I can run on my computer because those are old games that don't require 3D graphics cards to run. Or my Windows display adapter can simulate the 3D graphics better than some of the graphics cards at the time could, so I can still play those games. So that's fine. My laptop can play those. I can play Doom all day long. That's not going to tax my system. If your computer is so old or so beat up that Doom is taxing it, you need a new computer. That's all there is to that. Really, that's it. I'm not opposed to retro gaming, or even old school gaming is the term I prefer. I prefer... Now, I do own a PS2 and a PS1, and I will buy physical games for those. I'm not going to pirate games for those. I will buy PlayStation 1 games. Most of the PS1 games I own are digital games I bought off of the PlayStation Store for my PS3. But I also own a lot of discs. I'm selective on the discs I buy because of the money. So I'm not saying I'll never give money to a scalper. I should backpedal on that. I'm just going to be more selective. You know, I'll only buy games that's the only way to get them. If that's the only way to get that game, then I'll buy it. Because some games I just want. I want physical copies of, just like everybody else. But mostly, physical games I buy is PS3 and PS4. So yes, I do have to buy a lot of those used. I'll admit to that. And I usually get them from eBay, which again are resellers. So it is what it is. Now, like I said, I'm not saying resellers are bad people. I'm just calling them scalpers, but it's up to you to decide if scalper is a bad thing or not. I'm just saying that's what they are. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on retro gaming. Stay cool.